The drive back from my attorney's office should have taken 40 minutes. I stretched it to nearly an hour because I kept pulling over. Sitting there with the engine running, just staring out at the Arizona desert and smiling like a fool. I had just signed the final paperwork. My older brother Gerald, God rest him, had left me everything. The mountain cabin in Flagstaff, the commercial property on the east side of Tucson, and the one that still didn't feel real, a portfolio of dividend-paying stocks worth just over $2.5 million. Gerald had never married, never had kids, and apparently he'd spent 30 years quietly building something remarkable while the rest of us assumed he was just getting by on his electrician's pension. I was 63 years old, and I had spent my entire adult life driving a delivery truck for a regional grocery chain. I wore the same 3 pairs of work pants on rotation. I clipped coupons. I brought a sandwich to lunch every single day for 22 years. My wife Patricia had passed 6 years prior, and since then I'd lived in our modest ranch house in Mesa, tending the garden she used to love, watching baseball, and trying not to feel like a man waiting for his own end. And then Gerald died, and everything changed. I wasn't going to sit on it. That wasn't me. The first person I wanted to tell was my son, Daniel, and my daughter-in-law, Renee. They'd been struggling, I knew that. Daniel worked in logistics management, middle of the pack, salary, good enough, but not great. Renee had quit her nursing job 2 years back, saying she wanted to start an online business, though from what I could see, the business mostly consisted of her buying things online rather than selling them. They had 2 kids, my grandchildren, Caleb and Sophie, and they lived in a house in Scottsdale that I privately thought was about 30% more house than they could comfortably afford. I wanted to help them. That was all I thought about during that long drive home. Maybe I could pay off their mortgage. Maybe set up college funds for Caleb and Sophie. Maybe finally take Daniel on that fishing trip to Montana he'd been talking about since he was 12 years old, and we never quite got the money together to do. I pulled into their neighborhood just after 4 in the afternoon. It was a Tuesday in October, warm still the way Tucson gets in fall, that thick golden light coming sideways through the saguaros. I parked on the street because their driveway was full, Daniel's truck and Renee's SUV both there, which surprised me. Daniel was usually at the office until 6 or later. I didn't call ahead. I almost never did. They'd told me 100 times I could stop by whenever I wanted, that I was always welcome, that the kids would love to see Grandpa. So I walked up the front path with a box of those butter cookies Caleb liked from the bakery near my house, and a heart so full I could barely stand it. I was about 15 feet from the front door when I heard them. The windows were cracked. The Sonoran Desert in October is the kind of perfect that makes you want every window open, and their voices carried clearly out into the still afternoon air. I recognized Renee's voice first. She had a way of speaking that always made me think she was addressing a boardroom, even when she was just asking someone to pass the salt. "You need to be the one to bring it up," she was saying. "He listens to you. He won't argue with you the way he would with me. I know that." Daniel's voice. Flat. Tired. "Then why are you dragging your feet on this? Gerald has been gone for 2 months. The estate is settled. That money is sitting there and your father is just what? Watering his tomatoes?" I stopped walking. I didn't decide to stop. My legs just quit. "It's his money, Renee. It's family money. Gerald would have wanted it to stay in the family. You know that." "I don't actually know that. Gerald barely knew you." There was a pause. A loaded one. "That's not a nice thing to say." "It's a true thing to say. Daniel." Her voice dropped in a way that meant the real conversation was starting. "We are upside down on this house by $60,000. My business needs capital to scale. Caleb's orthodontist bill alone is going to be $14,000. And that's before we even talk about Sophie's camp fees and the trip to Cabo that we already put the deposit down on." "You put the deposit down." "I didn't agree to that trip. We needed something. Daniel, I needed something. Do you have any idea what it's like to look? This isn't about me. This is about your father having more money than he will ever be able to use at his age and his lifestyle, and us drowning. Right now, today, he doesn't even travel. He doesn't do anything. What is he saving it for?" I realized I was holding the box of cookies with both hands, pressing them against my sternum like a shield. "He might want to do things," Daniel said, but I could hear it in his voice, that slow collapse of a man who has had this argument too many times. Like what? He watches the Diamondbacks and grows peppers. Dad is not going to backpack through Europe, Daniel. He's 63. He's got a bad knee. And his idea of a big night out is the early bird special at Denny's. A short, sharp exhale. I love your father. You know I do. But we need to be practical. You're his only child. This money will come to you eventually anyway. All we're asking is that he share some of it now, when we actually need it, instead of letting it sit in some brokerage account while we're killing ourselves trying to stay afloat. I stood there on that front path for what felt like a very long time. The October sun was warm on the back of my neck. A quail was calling somewhere in the oleanders along the fence. Inside, my son said nothing. He could give you $1 million and still have more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life, Renee continued. Financial advisors say seniors are actually happiest when they give. There are articles about it. It reduces anxiety. It gives them purpose. I almost laughed at that. Almost. I'll think about it, Daniel said. You always say that. Because you always spring this on me when I'm already exhausted. When would be a good time, Daniel? Because our visa bill is due on the 15th, and I turned around and walked back to my truck. Quietly, the way I'd learned to move in 40 years of early morning delivery routes, when you get good at not waking a sleeping neighborhood. I set the cookies on the passenger seat. I started the engine and I drove away, and Renee and my son never knew I'd been there. I didn't go home. I drove out past the city, out where the desert opens up and you can see the mountains going blue in the distance. And I drove until I found a pull-off I used to take Patricia to sometimes to watch the sunset. I parked there and I sat with the engine off and I listened to the desert cool down around me, that faint tick and whisper it makes at the end of a warm day. I thought about Renee's voice. The certainty in it. The way she'd mapped out my life and my usefulness and my desires like a spreadsheet she'd already finished running. He doesn't even travel. He doesn't do anything. What is he saving it for? I thought about my son saying I'll think about it instead of, that's not how we talk about my father. I thought about Patricia, who had wanted so much to see Daniel settled and happy, who had loved Renee with a generosity that I was increasingly aware Renee had never fully returned. Patricia had taught me something once, early in our marriage, during a fight that I no longer remember the cause of but whose lesson stayed with me. She said, Raymond, you cannot pour from an empty cup, but you also cannot pour into a broken one. I sat in that pull-off until the stars came out. Then I drove home and called my attorney. The next morning, I was back in Howard Kemp's office. Howard had handled my family's legal matters for over 20 years, and he had one of those faces that showed absolutely nothing, which is exactly what you want in a lawyer. I told him what I'd heard. He listened without interrupting. What do you want to do? He asked when I'd finished. I want to protect the asset, I said. All of it. Put it somewhere Daniel can't access unless I specifically authorize it. And I want to restructure how I'm holding the commercial property. Howard nodded slowly. We can put the investment portfolio into a revocable trust with you as sole trustee. You retain complete control during your lifetime. It becomes irrevocable only upon your death, at which point disbursement is governed by whatever terms you set now. He paused. And the beneficiary? My grandchildren, I said. Caleb and Sophie, in equal shares, held in trust until they're 25. A separate trustee to manage it, not Daniel, not Renee. Howard wrote something down. And Daniel? I looked out his office window at the city below. I want to think about that part. That's fine. We have time. He set down his pen. Raymond, can I ask you something as a friend, rather than as your attorney? Go ahead. Are you sure you want to make permanent decisions based on one conversation you overheard? It was a fair question. Howard was a fair man. I'm not making permanent decisions, I said. I'm making careful ones. There's a difference. He seemed to accept that. We spent 2 hours in that office, and when I left, the trust documents were drafted, and I had an appointment for the following week to review and sign. I drove to Daniel's office that afternoon. I hadn't told him I was coming. He had a mid-level manager's space in a business park off the freeway glass and gray carpet and the faint smell of burned coffee. His assistant, a young woman named Tess, recognized me, and waved me back. Daniel looked up from his computer when I knocked on the open door. He had my coloring, my jawline, but Patricia's eyes, that particular dark brown that could look either warm or serious depending on the light. "Dad." He stood, genuinely surprised. "Hey, what are you? Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said. "I was in the area. Thought I'd take you to lunch if you've got an hour." He glanced at his screen, then back at me. Yeah, absolutely." We went to a barbecue place he liked nearby. I let him talk about work, about Caleb's soccer team, about a home repair he'd been putting off. I watched his face. He was tired in a way that had been there for a while, the slow tiredness of a man carrying more than he lets on. I had felt that weight myself. Once, I recognized it. When the food came, he finally said what I knew he'd been circling since I walked into his office. "Hey, Dad, there's something I've been meaning to bring up with you. About Gerald's estate." "All right," I said. He had rehearsed this. I could tell by the way he breathed before he started. "Renee and I have been talking. And look, I want to be upfront with you. We're in a tighter spot financially than I've let on. Nothing catastrophic, but it's been stressful. And I guess I just wanted to ask, not demand. Just ask whether you'd considered doing anything with the inheritance. Like, whether you'd thought about the family at all in those plans." He had the decency to look uncomfortable saying it. "I've thought about it," I said. "Right. Of course." He nodded quickly. "And I'm not trying to pressure you. It's your money. Gerald left it to you. Renee and I, we have some things we're trying to manage. And if there was any way—" "Daniel." I set down my fork. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. When did you get home yesterday?" He blinked. "Yesterday? I left early. Around 3. Renee wanted me home for something." "Why?" "I stopped by your house yesterday afternoon," I said. "Around 4. I was going to surprise you." I let that sit for a moment. "You weren't aware of that." The color in his face shifted. Slowly, like a cloud passing. "Dad, I heard enough," I said. Quietly. No anger in it, because I had used up the anger sitting in that desert pull-off. What was left was something quieter and much harder to dismiss. "I'm not here to make you feel terrible. I'm here because you're my son and I love you and I want us to be honest with each other." He had his mother's eyes, and right then they were doing what Patricia's had done when she was ashamed of something, going very still, very deep. "How much did you hear?" he asked. "Enough to understand how I'm thought of," I said, "and enough to make some decisions." "Dad." Whatever she said, Renee gets stressed. And "This isn't about Renee," I said. "I mean, it is, but it isn't. You didn't stop her, Daniel. That's what I keep coming back to. You were tired and you said you'd think about it, but you didn't say that's not how we talk about my father." He opened his mouth and closed it again. We sat with that for a while. Around us, the lunch crowd was loud and cheerful and oblivious. "I had plans," I said finally. "When I was driving home from Howard's office, I had all kinds of plans. Pay off your mortgage, college funds for the kids, maybe even help Renee get her business off the ground." I picked up my fork again, but I couldn't even get out of my truck. "Dad, let me finish." I wasn't harsh about it. I've done a lot of thinking since yesterday, and what I keep coming back to is something your mother used to say. I told him what Patricia had told me all those years ago, about pouring and empty cups and broken ones. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. He wasn't a man who cried easily. I had raised him not to be ashamed of it. But he held his emotions the way men his age tend to, just below the surface. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice had gone rough. "I am genuinely sorry, Dad. What she said about you, what I let her say that was wrong, that was really wrong. I know you know that. What are you going to do?" I looked at him steadily. "I've already done some of it," I said. "The portfolio is in a trust now. Caleb and Sophie are the beneficiaries. They'll have access to it when they're 25. A trustee I choose will manage it." He absorbed this. "And the property? The Tucson property is going into a separate LLC. I'll manage it and take the income." I paused. "I'm not cutting you out of my life. You're my son. I want to see you, and I want to see my grandchildren, but I will not be managed, and I will not be a line item in someone else's budget." He nodded. Just once. Slow. "Does Renee know?" he asked. "Not yet." "That's a conversation you need to have." He looked down at his food. "She's going to be upset." "I imagine so." I gave him a moment. "Daniel, I want to say one more thing, and then we can let this go for today. Your mother worked her entire life alongside me. We didn't have much. We never had much. But we never once sat in our living room and talked about your grandparents' money like it was something owed to us. That distinction matters to me." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "You're right. It does." We finished lunch. We talked about Caleb's soccer and the Diamondbacks' pitching problems, and a documentary I'd watched about the construction of the Hoover Dam. When we hugged in the parking lot, he held on a little longer than usual. "I'll call you this weekend," he said. "I'll be home," I said. "I'm always home." What happened over the following weeks was not dramatic. Real things rarely are. Renee called me 2 days after my lunch with Daniel. She was controlled on the phone, the way she got when she was angry, and knew she couldn't show it. She said she understood why I was upset. She said she hoped I knew that she had only ever wanted what was best for the family. She said that things had been difficult, and sometimes people said things under stress that didn't reflect how they truly felt. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Renee, I appreciate you calling. I'd like to put this behind us, but I want to be clear that my financial arrangements are not open for family discussion going forward. That chapter is closed." There was a long pause. "Of course," she said. "Of course, Raymond." About 3 weeks after that, I got a call from Howard. The commercial property in Tucson had attracted serious interest from a regional medical group looking to lease it long-term. The annual income from the lease, once finalized, would be enough for me to live on comfortably and then some without touching the investment portfolio at all. I drove out to the pull-off in the desert that evening, the one where Patricia and I used to watch the sun go down. I sat there with the windows open, listening to the quails and the distant sound of a highway, and I thought about what 63 years of a life actually looked like from the inside. The delivery truck, the coupons, the mortgages we scrimped to pay on time, Patricia's laugh at the kitchen table, Daniel at 12 years old asking about Montana. I had spent a long time being a man who made do. I pulled out my phone and booked 2 tickets to Bozeman, Montana. One for me and one for Daniel. 7 days in June, a guided fishing outfit on the Gallatin River, a cabin with a porch that looked out at the mountains. I texted Daniel the confirmation number and wrote, "Still want to catch a trout?" He replied in under a minute, "Dad, are you serious?" "Deadly serious," I wrote back. "And you're buying dinner every night. Consider it a deposit on the next 60 years. He sent back a string of emojis that I mostly couldn't interpret, but the last one was a fish. I took that as a yes. The trust was finalized on a Thursday morning in November. Howard walked me through the final documents one more time the way he always did, patient and thorough, making sure I understood every line. Caleb and Sophie, in equal shares. At 25, an independent trustee, a woman Howard had worked with for years, sharp and fiercely ethical. The only modification I'd made from the original plan was a clause allowing the trustee to release funds early for education, expenses, tuition, books, housing. I wanted those kids to be able to go to whatever school they could get into without worrying about how to pay for it. I signed my name at the bottom and set down the pen. "How do you feel?" Howard asked. "Settled," I said. And I meant it. On the drive home, I stopped at the bakery and bought a box of those butter cookies, the ones Caleb liked, and drove over to Daniel's house. Renee answered, polite and a little careful, and I told her I wanted to stop by and see the grandkids if that was all right. It was a Saturday, so everyone was home. Sophie ambushed me at the front door the way she always did, wrapping both arms around my leg and demanding to know if I'd brought the cookies. Caleb, who was 12 now, and had recently decided that hugging grandparents was no longer age-appropriate, gave me a firm handshake that I accepted with great seriousness. Renee made coffee. She and I spoke carefully, the way two people do when they are both aware of a truce and both choosing to honor it. It was not warm, but it was civil. and civil was something I could work with. Daniel watched me over his mug with those dark eyes of his, and I could see that he had done some of the work that needed doing. He looked less like a man being managed and more like a man who had made a decision to stand up straight. After the cookies were gone and Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch and Caleb had retreated to his room, I sat with Daniel on the back porch while the Arizona evening came on soft and golden. "Montana is going to be cold in June," he said. "Good kind of cold," I said. "I haven't fished since before Caleb was born." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "Dad, I want to say again, you don't have to. I want to." He looked at me. "I should have defended you. That's the simple truth of it. Whatever was going on with the money, whatever stress we were under, you are my father. And I should have said something. I'm going to do better at that." I looked at my son in the last of the October light. He had my jawline and Patricia's eyes, and somewhere in him, I hoped, some small piece of what we'd tried to build together during all those ordinary years. "That's all I ever wanted," I said. "That's the whole thing. Right there." We sat there until the stars appeared, which is one of the things Arizona does right, a sky so wide and so dark that the stars seem close enough to trouble you. Sophie wandered out sleepy-eyed and climbed into my lap without being asked, which is the particular gift that small children give you, that absolute and unearned trust. I held her and looked at the sky. I thought about Gerald, who had never married and never had children but had spent 30 years building something that would now go to these two kids who had never met him. I thought about Patricia, who would have known exactly what to say to Renee, something firm and loving in equal measure, the way she'd handled everything. I thought about a delivery truck and a 40-year career, and the way a life accumulates meaning in places you don't expect, in coupons and sandwiches and baseball games, and a boy asking about Montana, in a pull-off in the desert where the sun goes down the same way it always has, regardless of what you're carrying. "Grandpa," Sophie said drowsily against my chest. "Yeah, Bug? Are you happy?" I had not been asked that question in a long time, not by anyone. I sat with it for a moment the way it deserved. "Yeah," I said. "I really am." She accepted this and went back to sleep in my lap. Above us, the desert sky turned from blue to black to something older than either, and the stars did what stars do, kept their own counsel, burned their own light, asked nothing of anyone. I drove home at 9 o'clock. I watered Patricia's garden in the dark, the way I did every night that time of year. The peppers were coming in strong. The tomatoes needed another week. I stood there in the dark backyard of my modest ranch house in Mesa, listening to the water, and thought about how strange and complete and non-negotiable a life turns out to be. I was a man who had worked 40 years driving a truck and raised a son, and loved his wife and clipped his coupons and brought his sandwiches. I was a man who had accidentally become the owner of a mountain cabin and a commercial property and $2.5 million in equities, and who had spent exactly none of it on anything so far, except a box of butter cookies and 2 plane tickets to Montana. I was 63 years old, and I had just signed my grandchildren's futures into a trust that no one could touch. And I was going fishing in June, and I was standing in a garden that still smelled like Patricia, and the stars over Arizona don't care about any of it, and neither did the quails. And the desert was the desert whether you were rich or not. I turned off the hose. I went inside. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down to watch the end of the game, and I was, in fact, happy.